Friends, to contextualize, to understand the complexities and context of this 2030 GTA, from macro global trends to what this means in our cities and towns, to how this is playing out in our neighborhoods, we are joined by three, dare I say, national treasures: practitioners, provocateurs, doo-doo disturbers. A conversation this morning with United Way friends Cheryll Case, co-founder of CP Planning, who, according to Spacing Magazine, is defining the practice of a human rights-based approach to urban planning. Recognized by U of T, Azure Magazine, and Jamaican Canadian Association, you will find Cheryll on the ground in and with communities Jane and Finch, Markham, Cooksville, at committee tables with CMHC and the Urban Land Institute, at discussions just like this at 9 a.m., consistently making the Cheryll case. Welcome, Cheryll.
Awesome. Thank you.
Next, Mary, impassioned, fastest talking, no BS, civic thinker and doer like no other, Rowe. Mary Rowe, President and CEO of the Canadian Urban Institute, with decades of experience in business, government, philanthropy in Canada and the US. Mary Rowe, the steady hand behind self-organizing initiatives in New Orleans, along the Gulf Coast following Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, and the recovery from Superstorm Sandy too. Mary now hangs locally with projects like Evergreen, Future Cities, National Urban Project, the Bentway, and Fogo Islands Shorefast. Hang on, folks, for Mary Rowe. And dulcis in fondo, the person that BNN Bloomberg dubbed one of the world's leading economic voices and visionaries. Financial Post said, cuts through numbers and tells our story like few others. A voice that global and national media, universities, and think tanks seek, and we have here, on the world's most pressing economic issues, from labor market dynamics to real estate to our economic future. Managing Director, Deputy Chief Economist, CIBC Capital Markets, Benjamin Tao. Friends, welcome all.
Nice to be with you.
Yeah, great to be here. Thank you for the invite.
Benjamin, we're going to start with you, friend. By soaring high and wide, maybe set the context on the sunrise of our next decade, as all the headlines are screaming affordability, high interest rates, low housing stock. How are these macroeconomic trends playing out over the next 10 years? And more specifically, how are they impacting lower income families and individuals experiencing poverty globally and locally?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Listen, we are going through a major economic change. I always think, to what extent COVID is an event or a condition? And COVID is a condition, economically speaking, that is impacting our life in a very significant way. What was normal in the past is not normal in the context of today's economy, and we have to understand that. So we start with the labor market, and the labor market has been relatively strong, relatively speaking. The labor market has been performing better than expected over the past few years. The unemployment rate was relatively low. And if we have this kind of poverty in this environment, the situation will get worse over time if we don't act, because the labor market hasn't been so strong in ages, and we still have poverty rising. We still have issues, people homeless. We know the story. And this is an environment in which the labor market was very, very strong. However, let me just throw one statistics to you, which I think is very interesting. Canada is the most educated country in the OECD in terms of the number of people going to universities, the most educated country in the OECD. But we are also the #1 country in terms of the number of educated people that live in poverty. We cannot translate those degrees into jobs because the labor market is changing. The labor market is changing at the speed of light, and the education system is behaving like nothing happened. So this kind of poverty will continue to happen, especially given the AI revolution. We know that we cannot stop it. However, it means that there will be winners and there will be many winners, but there will be losers, and there will be many of them, like in any other technological revolution. And I'm very concerned about the losers, because the labor market of tomorrow will be a very different labor market. The education system is behaving like nothing happened. And that's something that we have to change. We have to make sure that we look at countries like Germany, where they have the dual system. You can have a BA in history and a minor in plumbing. This is something that is a joke here, but that's the reality in Germany and Europe. We have to rethink education in a very significant way. And it's not just computer engineers, it's plumbers, electricians. We have a crisis, a housing market crisis. At the core of the issue is this housing market crisis. We have a generation of Canadians that cannot dream about owning a house. I had an opportunity to meet with the government a few months ago, and I told them, if we don't treat the housing crisis, the housing affordability crisis that we are dealing with urgency, we are going to have pockets of civil unrest. We are going to have anti-immigrant sentiments. We are going to have renter strikes, and it's written on the wall. I can see it. The trajectory is very clear to me. We have to deal with the housing crisis in a very urgent way. And one way of doing it is actually making sure that the demand for housing is not as strong coming from non-permanent residents, especially foreign students. The number of foreign students went up dramatically. The crisis that we are facing in housing is a planning crisis. We have to realize that 10 years ago, the plan was population growth will be X. Today, the population growth was X plus 1.5 million people. Most of them non-permanent residents, foreign students. If you cannot house them, don't bring them. And that's exactly what the government is doing now, cutting the number from 6.5 to 5, because they are all in the housing market, in the rental market, and that's why rent is so expensive. That's one thing that we have to do. We have to help renters. We have to allow for a rental solution for this housing crisis, but we have to also provide renters with a break. We have to provide the ability to deduct income or tax from your taxes and to deduct the rent from that taxes. It's extremely important. The current situation now is really distinguishing between homeowners and a renter. And we have to basically make the playing field even, because it's not fair now for renters. I'm very concerned about the next few years. I think that the mismatch in the labor market is growing. There is labor surplus and there is labor shortage. Labor shortage, we all know what's happening. We simply don't have enough trades. We don't have enough computer engineers, but also we have shortage, we have surplus in the labor market. And those people need re-education. They need training. Otherwise, they will be unemployable. And that's exactly where we're going. We need the help that you can provide in training. The labor market is changing at the speed of light. The education system, the system as a whole, is behaving like nothing happened. We have to wake up. We are now in the middle of a recession. It's a per capita recession. The unemployment rate will go up over the next year too. The unemployment rate will remain elevated because of the fact that people that are unemployable now will not be able to find a job in the AI revolution era. We have to change that. We have to change education. We have to get more people into the labor market. We have to provide incentives through the tax system. Look at Nova Scotia, construction. They have a shortage. They say if you're under 30, for the first $50,000, no tax whatsoever. Something like that. We have to provide incentives to get into the labor market, and education is key. So I will stop here and we'll continue later.
Benjamin, thank you. What a setting and what a context for Mary to take over on. Mary, integrating some of Benjamin's macro trends, and then this quote from Jane Jacobs where she says, our cities, our streets are ever changing and ever absorbing the pains of global, the proximity of local, and the smell and taste of your neighborhood food stand. What are you seeing as the state of our cities and neighborhoods today? And what are you thinking is accessible, available a decade hence?
Well, thank you for asking me to come on, Daniele. And I was very interested to listen to the end of the AGM. And I'm so appreciative of yours and Lisa's leadership, because the United Way model illustrates what the kind of approach that we need to do across every sector. This idea of networked solution finding and network resource gathering. So I just want to hats off to the lots of folks on this call, and not just the people here in the panel, but to the ones in the audience who have been long time supporters of the United Way. It's just a really fundamentally important model. And I also just want to call out your family analogy about the beehive, because that's in fact what communities are. They are hives of diversities. And the business that I'm in at CUI is we're about the connective tissue between hives, basically, and how do we actually double down on creating those kinds of connections. So as much as I'm sympathetic to Ben's analysis of the labor market and the mismatch that we're seeing, and I do agree with you, Ben, around that COVID is more a condition than an isolated event. And we're still seeing all sorts of ways in which the COVID hangover effect is generating all sorts of different kinds of behaviors. And one of the ones that we're concerned about is people becoming more wedded to where they actually sleep rather than where they, sharing it with where they work and where they have fun and where they meet others. And when I go back to my hiving analogy here, which is yours, Daniele, I'm borrowing it from you, is that we're so interdependent. Cities and neighborhoods are so interdependent. And when I came into the role at CUI, I said, we have to be about fostering a connective tissue. So what I would say in answer to your question is this: the built environment, all the things that we take for granted around us, how things are planned, how things are zoned. And this is what Cheryl's going to speak to as a planner. I'm not a planner, but she will speak to it in a more expert way than me. But the way in which we actually construct the physical conditions in our community has an extraordinary impact on the healthy functioning of that place. And your work in the Golden Mile, the interventions that you're looking at in Scarborough are in fact finding ways to correct mistakes that were made decades ago that actually severed connections. So if we were to really think simply, you mentioned my work in New Orleans, and when I was there, listening to the locals, learning, what I observed in a community that of thousands that had been completely leveled is that two organic patterns of interaction emerged. One was, and I have a little napkin that I show a diagram of it. One was hubs, exactly what you're trying to reinforce in the pilot work that you're doing and around the GTA. Places where people can go with people who are of similar kinds of questions, interests, curiosities. They attract one another and they have a place to go to do whatever it is they want to do: cook, play some kind of sport, do some kind of craft, start a business, read a book, whatever it is. Hubs, really critical to have those kinds of places and spaces, and no one is the same as the other. I would hate to think that we would industrialize hubs and start to decide they've all got to look the same and be the same, because they sure as heck shouldn't be. They should be unique to the conditions, those enabling conditions in that place. But the other piece is links. Hubs and links. Hubs for when you want to aggregate and get reinforcement and understand what's going on and have some sense making. Links to bridge you to someone or some set of circumstances that are not you, that are different than you, that supplement what you experience in your local community. And we need both. And when you look at really healthy urban environments, what you see is lots of places, lots of hubs, different kinds of places, and lots of ways to connect across. And so just imagine what that means. The connections are things like sidewalks, transit, being able to get from one place to another, different kinds of mobility options, lots of different ways that people can actually connect with someone. Internet, or this is a big one. How do we connect with people that can bring us something, or we can add something that's different? And then in terms of hubs, libraries, third spaces, community spaces, small businesses, all the things that actually most of us take for granted. The dilemma that we've got, and I'll just wrap up here and just echo a bit of what Ben said and what Daniele, you were hinting at. We're seeing, because of the flow of global capital, and lots of other complicated things. There are people on this call much more learned than me that will be able to speak to this. We're seeing a kind of tamping down of local capacity and local opportunity, so that third spaces are being taken over by condo developments, or we have to be much more intentional about, even the city governments are starting to shed their office spaces because people aren't coming back to the office. So as churches, faith spaces, they're closing. Hundreds and hundreds of them are closing across the country. These are all places that used to have some kind of hub function, post offices, the list goes on, banks. Now we have to be really thoughtful and imaginative about how we reinsert those kinds of places and spaces, and how do we provide programming and support for one another in those places. So I'll put that out as just saluting the campaign you've got for more hubs. And then also at the same time, we've got to try to double down on, this is hard because this is a COVID effect. People are not using transit the way they once did, and we've got to find a way to bring ourselves back into close proximity with one another. And the biggest challenge there is, how do we address mental health? Because we are all struggling with different kinds of mental health challenges, and that manifests in different environments in different places. And that's going to only be solved by a community response of all the sectors working together to figure out how we support one another. Thanks for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Don't go anywhere. We're coming back to you. Best community tactician in the country. Now we know why. I love this concept of hubs and links, Mary. Food for Cheryl, as you think about Mary's comment, Cheryl, local tapping down. Take us close to the ground in the communities you're working in, whether it's Cooksville, Little Jamaica, South Etobicoke. What does community planning and organizing look like at a neighborhood level today? And how tapped out or off the table are voices from this planning process?
Yeah, thanks for that prompt. So I think maybe I'll start with going off on what Benjamin Tall mentioned around our education system, right? So the need to build more affordable housing, build more green spaces, more community spaces. You know, you very well articulated the need for that, as well as Mary. And when we look at the education, the labor to actually generate that supply, that's labor is not being generated, right? In Ontario, we have the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing say that we need more planners. And so what we're dealing with now is having to train up all these super passionate people who want to get the job done, who are kind of like, you know, bees in a swarm, going off little signals here and there, figuring out how to do the dance. And so, you know, it's really heartwarming to see the amount of passion and vigor that people have for investing in this, because these are people who are doing it, many of them as volunteers, right? For example, in Little Jamaica, it's a completely volunteer-led effort of seniors, retired folks who are leading the charge, trying to engage in the planning process. In Mount Dennis, you have the local community center who has taken the risk to start exploring how to be engaged in building affordable housing and community space. Now they're the only affordable housing project in a neighborhood that is slated to have major transit investment, with the Eglinton LRT opening sometime in the hopefully near future. And same with Cooksville as well, right? We've been working with Indus in Cooksville for over 2 years now, and we see their passion is there, and we're really excited to see their continued development in shaping the context of the conversation of what does community really want, right? And that's really why I'm so proud to be doing the work that I'm doing, because what I found in engaging with all of these communities across the Greater Toronto Area, in New York, in Peel region, in Toronto, also in other cities, these community groups, they're very actively engaged in the process, but without a platform to be able to express publicly what their vision is, to build partnerships and not to rely on others, but to actually have that ownership, right? We talk about ownership of property, but also there's a value of ownership of process. So being able to support communities to build out processes, and then also to build partnerships through that process with, you know, leading industry folks like the great folks here in the United Way and all your great partners, with planning firms, with developers, with investors, to take these ideas and make them real.
I don't want you to stop, Cheryl. Did you freeze, or are you pausing for a thought?
Well, I mean, I could go on, right? So, I think another part of this I'd like to share around that piece of how communities are involved in the planning process. I think it'd be valuable for me to share a little bit about how I got involved as well.
Please.
And so, just like many of the other planners that I work with, I myself came upon this in a very ad hoc way with I'm 29 now, so I started this work when I was 22, right out of my university undergrad at Toronto Metropolitan University, formerly Ryerson University. And in that school, the general education that you receive in planning at the time, maybe it's changed somewhat. We're a bit more enlightened now around equity, diversity, and inclusion. But the summary was that, well, the building to your left is 10 stories tall, and the color on the zoning map says is red, then you could probably also build 10 stories tall. If it's yellow, then don't even think about it, right? Without considerations around the equity, without considerations around equity and are we actually gonna be building the housing supply that meets the demand for housing? So it was in my final year of my final semester where we had a course project where we were to identify a problem in planning and a solution to that problem. So the problem that I chose was a problem around the lack of affordable housing being built, and this interesting inconsistency between the fact that in neighborhoods, the neighborhood I grew up in Kipling and Dixon neighborhood, if folks are familiar, and in that neighborhood we had classes closing every year. So we had no French class in grade, I think we had no French class in grade 11. If not 10, we had, band closing, we had no strings, violin. I played violin in grade 9 and I wasn't able to continue. And so we had classes closing because there was no population growth. The population had been stagnant for 30 years. And so in my research, I found that actually 2/3 of the city of Toronto had been stagnant or losing population since the 1980s. And that's because we're not allowing new development to happen. Meanwhile, there's all this great narrative around, well, we're building so much housing. Well, where are we building the housing? We're building it in the downtown. Those places aren't able to have any schools. And so, I was very dedicated in my research and I published it, decided that I was worthy of publishing my research. I thought it was good enough. And lo and behold, it seemed to be, because that research was actually picked up by the Toronto Star, by the Globe and Mail. They're publishing my research or citing my research in China. Toronto Metropolitan University, Sherry's Berta cited my research. I would go to conferences and my research would be put up on the screen. And so I was very fortunate to have mentors in my life who saw the value of what I was doing and said, well, you know what, Cheryl, go out there and pitch projects and let's see if you can get them funded. And so that's what I did. I pitched my first project that I got funded was a $10,000 study around approvals along transit lines in Toronto. And that was used by the Ontario Homebuilders Association in their conversations with the OMB around development approvals. And so, continuing that journey around with great support from mentors saying, believe in yourself, you can go and do this. The next project that we did was a $25,000 project funded by Leila Foundation called Housing in Focus. And this one was really special because this is where we tested out this concept of a human rights approach to planning. So one of the things you learn in planning schools is you have your law course and you learn about the concept of human rights. And following that, I decided to do a deep dive into exploring, well, what is this concept of human rights? What are some examples of how human rights have been infringed upon through the planning process? And I think one of the earliest examples I'll give, and I'll put this really quickly, I'll try, was 1903. 1903 was when the first permit was filed to build an apartment building in the city of Toronto. And it's an apartment building no more than 4 stories tall. In that same year, the Canadian Builders and Architects magazine published an article stating that apartment building will lead to women no longer having care in homekeeping or raising a family. So the planning process has a very significant social bias against women's independence, right? And so this is the context that we're living in today when we think about, well, why is it so hard to build affordable missing middle housing, low-rise housing? Why is it so difficult to protect commercial spaces, right? The fact is that these were not the top priorities of the system, generally speaking. And so when we did our Housing in Focus project, the idea was to engage with community groups across Toronto. So I engaged, as a 23-year-old, we got Parkdale, South Etobicoke, Danforth, Maine, and also the Golden Mile. We work with the great folks there to explore with community members, what would your neighborhood look like if housing was a human right? And so what was really fascinating to see was the difference between what came out from this process versus what comes out from a traditional planning process, which is, again, it's 10 stories here, what's the color on the ground kind of deal. And what the communities came up with was they supported way more density. Like if I was to do the summary of it, I think it's like 4 to 5 times more dense than what the traditional process comes out with. They supported low-rise housing up to 4 stories within blocks, like not just on the front line of a main street as we have today, but actually going in 2 to 3 blocks within. And they also surprisingly also supported lots of co-op housing as well. So they saw the value of, again, that goes back to that community ownership of property. And so, with that as my mandate, all right, okay, well, there's clearly a difference between what the traditional process puts forward versus what community wants, right? They want denser, they want density in the neighborhoods, they want the high rises, all that stuff. But the key for them was the co-op, that community ownership. And so since then, since 2019, with the Housing in Focus project, I was very well affirmed that this is a service that is required. And what's also, I think, key to note here is that Housing in Focus, between me getting the funding and completing the project, was 4 months. And so that's me getting all the partnerships together in 4 months, co-creating in that time, hosting the events, summarizing the events, hosting the completion party. And the reason I bring that up is because that speaks to the demand for this service and for this support. Communities are hungry, they're ready, they just need that support, and really honored to be able to provide that support with United Way agencies and with other agencies as well, because again, we need to have that community ownership of the process as well to really see that outcomes in affordability in commercial spaces and in housing.
I'm so glad you continue to tell your journey, talking about the ownership of the process, but also expanding on the legacy of housing and developments and this space we're in now about affordable housing, often left off the continuum of discussion, let alone deeply affordable housing. Benjamin, over to you and an article you wrote in the Globe and Mail in April, where you pushed on the propensity to rent in Canada must rise, and the market needs to realign to increase the supply of rental units. And you suggested better availability of low-cost financing for purpose-built rentals, along with the recent removal of the GST and HST, is already starting to change the math. Talk to us about what are the next steps we need to accelerate purpose-built rental.
Yes, this is very important because, first of all, when it comes to affordable housing, affordable rental, Canada is basically the last in the OECD per capita in terms of how we build. So clearly the government has to play a role, a direct role in building affordable housing, because we are not there. We're not even close to the average of the OECD. So at the minimum, let's go to the average. This is going to be a significant investment in affordable housing that we need. That is not market rent, it's affordable rent. That's one thing. But we have to realize that what happened over the past 10, 15 years is that the condo market became the rental market, and the rental market became the condo market. This is not an ideal situation. I want to create a situation in which you are 35 years old, you are married, you have 2 kids, and you are renting. Nothing is wrong with you. The way it is in Manhattan, the way it is in London, the way it is in Berlin. For some reason, we have this stigma that renting means that you have a failure. We have to change that. The only way to change that is to provide purpose-built rental supply. The new wave of renters will be young people, young families with kids, and older people downsizing. And they need to deal with a company, not a landlord. So we need to cut significantly the cost of building purpose-built rental. And I've been very vocal about it because that's one of the most significant ways to reduce the affordability crisis that we are facing. So I say, we have to really suggest to the government, and I've been very vocal about it, to support purpose-built rental. First of all, make sure that the HST, GST is not there. And that's exactly what happened. It's providing incentives to developers to build purpose-built rental as opposed to condos. And that's exactly what's happening. The other thing is CMHC. We need much more funding and cheap funding to build those purpose-built rentals. And it's doable. We can do that. Another factor is what we call 1031 exchange, which is the way you treat capital gain taxes when you sell a purpose-built rental. In the US, when you sell a building, and you take the money, you don't pay tax on it if you invest in another building. So there is incentive to invest in more and more and more. So we want to introduce it in Canada. I really hope I'm pushing to promote it in Canada because that will provide a dynamics that is not there now in the market. So there are many ways to provide, for example, leasing land. Who says that you have to sell the land, lease the land? That will reduce the cost of purchasing significantly and will allow builders to build more purpose-built. Many things that we can do to provide this affordability that we desperately need. That's one thing that we have to deal with. The other is education. We need to rethink education, as I said, and as was suggested before me. This is something that we have failed to do. The labor market is changing. The labor market in the past was able to provide low education people with opportunities. That will not be the case now. And again, when I talk about education, I'm talking about relevant education. I'm not talking about, you don't have to be an engineer, but we need plumbers, we need electricians. Only 7% of women are in apprentices programs. 7% of apprentices programs are women. It should be 50%. So there are many ways to deal with the situation if we just channel our energy in the right place.
Your voice, though, Benjamin, so critical in offering a suite of practical tools, some that we have recommended in our research and public affairs work with different levels of government on how they can and should both protect our current purpose-built rental at risk of losing that and create incentives and opportunities to grow more within what may be, as you said, a shift of perception on rental and ownership for generations to come. And we know that purpose-built rental is also part, Mary, of what is a healthy Main Street, a healthy, vibrant town, downtown, urban core, that and some of the connective tissue that you talked about earlier. As you think about our next 10 years, what are some of the practical things that come to mind, taking from either Benjamin or Cheryll or the work you've been doing at the Canadian Urban Institute on ways that we can build and create neighborhoods within these mini cities that are being created? Practical tools.
You know, the mantra we've been using is people, place, potential. That's what a city is. I love the backdrop that we've got because it's a triangle, and that's really the pyramid of I was going to say the pyramid of progress, but progress isn't the right word. But it's let's hope it's the pyramid of prosperity. I hope it is. But so I think in terms of our work, we started it early in the pandemic to look at two things: downtowns and main streets. Downtowns being the hearts, and there are many different kinds of downtowns. The hearts of communities where people are coming to, gathering, and there's lots of exchange and aggregation of all sorts of capital, human capital, economic capital. And then main streets being the spines of communities and spines of cities, of which there are many, and you want to see all sorts of different kinds of main streets. That's, again, the interesting thing here is they don't all need to look the same. But what both Cheryll and Benjamin are getting at is the relationship between the performance, and I talk about performance as in functioning, the healthy functioning of a neighborhood, how dependent that is on the actual allocation of space and housing and the mix, the diversity of choices. Right. And what Benjamin's observing is that we've seen a diminishment of choices because capital has come in, the market comes in and like water goes the easiest path. And the dilemma is what you see is more and more housing being created that's only catering to a very, very narrow swath of the market. So it's diminishing choice. And if, as Cheryll is suggesting, you take a human rights approach to housing, then you've got to have a range of choice along income, along a family size, along uses, ages, demographics, all that stuff. So for us, to try to ground it in a practical conversation, in downtowns, we've got a really remarkable opportunity to convert commercial spaces into different kinds of uses. So rather than wringing our hands a lot and talking about whether or not we're going to ever see the kind of concentration of office workers that we once saw, let's be imaginative. Cities change over millennia. They change and change and change. And so let's look at the built form assets we've got and figure out how we can actually integrate different kinds of uses. So that could easily be student housing, could be long-term care, could be co-housing. There's a whole bunch of great ideas that are starting to surface. And what we need to do is, I think, and I'll be interested to see if Cheryll would agree with me on this, I think part of our concern is that zoning and planning has constrained in lots of cases this kind of trying different things, different kinds of pilots. So that's the first thing. And on main streets, again, back to the spines, back to one of the good things we learned about COVID, which is that you're really dependent on your immediate neighbors. They are your community. And that, you know, like a muscle, if you don't use it, you lose it. And so for all of us to be actually actively engaged in our main streets. And so part of what we're looking at is how do you introduce different kinds of housing forms back onto main streets? Because what happens when a main street redevelops, everybody knows what I'm going to say, whether it's a strip mall, yay, strip malls, I love strip malls, or if it's an old-fashioned, more traditional main street, if it redevelops, the development capital that comes in there goes higher, so you get more housing units. But invariably, you get market rate units, and you push out all that affordable housing that lived when you lived above the store.
Yes.
And so now what we've got to look at is other kinds of ownership models, I mentioned churches before, other community centers. How do we create community-owned real estate? And so that's the question. When you talk about advancing purpose-built real estate, which I'm totally agreeing with you on, Benjamin, what I'm interested in is, are there other kinds of financial tools? And there are lots of people on this call who have access to these kinds of financial tools or could create some new ones, so that communities could actually be purchasing and owning their buildings and creating the housing. We used to do this better 40 or 50 years ago. Not-for-profits would create housing units. They had support from all orders of government. And we need to get back to that, where communities can self-organize. Maybe it's a faith community, maybe it's a special interest community, maybe it's a bunch of curling people. I don't know what it is, but that we all self-organize and start to create what is that missing middle, what Cheryll cited, and that they can be community owned, because that's the only way, I think, to buffet the impact of the market. The dilemma that you're suggesting around Berlin and London and cities where New York, where there are higher degrees of tenants, although, you know, in Toronto, we're over 50% tenants, but the concern is you are vulnerable.
Yes.
You're vulnerable to, there are two concerns. One is you're vulnerable to the landlord, but the other thing is you don't have a vehicle to build equity. And it leaves you economically, it leaves you behind. So we've got to try to figure out other ways to create equity so that you can continue to be a renter and have another vehicle for building equity other than your house. And we need to strengthen the capacity for communities to actually, different models to own dwellings, and then we will see a restoring of that housing choice, that mix across a continuum.
So many beautiful segues, Mary, and thank you for Cheryll to pick up on this tension between zoning and planning constraints. But then, Cheryll, a community's ability to self-organize. Please give us hope. Give us hope. What is happening on the ground? Are there projects you are working on locally across the GTA where you are seeing community self-organizing in innovative ways, and government, corporations sitting at that table, partnering with them?
Yes, I think the work that we've been doing in Gin and Finch would be a really excellent example of that cross-sectoral partnership. So in Gin and Finch is a neighborhood in Toronto's Northwest. It has a higher Black population than most others. It's traditionally lower income. It has a lot of community housing as well. They are going to be having a new LRT come through the neighborhood. So that's generating a lot of interest for new development. Also, there's a lot of risk for displacement. There's also been displacement just for the fact of THC housing renovations and renewals, right? A whole building was demolished with the residents given very little notice originally around that, and they had to do a lot of community organizing in order to delay their displacement. But what's really exciting around this piece of this collaboration, so we have been working with the City of Toronto on our roadmap for redevelopment plans to confront systemic racism. This is a project that's going on in many cities, but in this context for Jane and Finch, what we did is we partnered with the Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit, and we brought in the Urban Land Institute being the oldest and I think one of the most respected, in my opinion, association of developers, planners, and city builders in North America for sure, with branches also in other parts of the world. And we hosted a technical advisory panel looking at addressing the displacement of Black households from neighborhoods such as Jane and Finch. And so we are really excited to have a really great partnership and engagement with the local agencies at the Jane and Finch Center and with community organizers as well for their feedback. We hosted, after lots of workshopping over many months, we hosted a 3-day workshop with the community organizations. We toured the neighborhood. They showed us, this is where the TCHC building was torn down and how we had to organize around that. They showed us the building that they're working in, the local mall where they're trying to see if they can build some affordable housing on that site. They showed us this other site. They're looking to have a community center being built. And so I'm really excited with what's coming out of this process. We have a report that's going to be coming out, I think, later in July, which is speaking towards the recommendations that emerged from this process. So we had over 80 industry professionals from the United States, from Canada, CIBC, nonprofit institutions, Wood Green, community residents and organizers, not just in that neighborhood, but in other neighborhoods, coming together, providing their suggestions, and our advisory panel of leading experts in Toronto, as well as a really great woman from New York, have come up with their recommendations, and they're supporting for the city just to in all levels of government really to work together in establishing a strategy to protect the existing affordable housing supply, right? Because that's really important. You don't want to just be building new supply. You need to be protecting what's already there. We know that at least 15 units of affordable housing is being lost for every one that's developed. And so what's really exciting about this report as well is that it doesn't just say that, oh, well, we need to just, generate the policies to do this, but also we need to be working with communities who have actually been at the forefront of bringing this issue front and center and top of mind, right? Because the Jane and Finch Center, the community organizers have been working on this much longer than the industry has been working on this topic, right? Because this is their daily lives, this is something they have to contend with for their survival, really, and for their community. And so that's really exciting work coming out of this, and really pleased also the Urban Land Institute is very committed to long-term partnership with this community group to support for the implementation of some of the recommendations that are coming out of this report. So I say that there's a lot of hope to be had. I think there has really been an awakening within the real estate industry and within the planning industry as well of the value of partnering with community groups to support their work in moving forward in being able to take ideas and turn them into real solutions. I've seen this in just about every neighborhood that we've worked in. There's, tons of developers and urban planners who are putting their hands up to help, saying, just find us a site. Well, we're going to be willing to help you to develop it. And so now the community is very actively working to be able to find those sites to leverage all this interest to support moving the needle forward in terms of protecting and increasing affordable housing supply, as well as community space as well.
Such a good example, Cheryll, of hope for the future that is actually practice of the past, of community development and planning, when decades ago groups and communities came together to think about this, and a history of, for example, United Way funding anchor partners like the Jane and Finch Center to do this community engagement work. So as much as we think about a decade forward, let's not forget some of the lessons of good old community development from years and years ago, when community had a voice at the table, when different allies and partners like government and corporations came together to plan neighborhoods in a holistic way. Lessons that we can, I think, take forward in the face of massive transformation going forward. So a lightning round now, friends, for each of you. I'm going to ask you to lean in and give us your wisdom on an area you've heard about as a emerging United Way ambition, and where from your seat you would push us to either do something more or think about different perspective. Benjamin, for you, given the breadth and depth of our research, policy, grant making, philanthropy, and the partners gathered at this annual meeting and beyond in our work, where do you think United Way can play a role on the housing file and around inclusive economic opportunities?
Yes, I think that the future is not written in stone. The future is a function of what we are going to do. And I think that the future can be very bright. It's going to be very challenging. I'm very concerned about the impact of AI on a segment of the population in terms of the labor market. The unemployment rate will be rising among low-income Canadians. I'm very concerned about it. There will be many winners, there will be many losers. We have to get ready for that. Training is extremely important. Education is extremely important, and that's I need you to push. We need to find an establishment, a framework in which more education is available, relevant education. And then, of course, affordable housing. I've been pushing this file for a long time. I will continue to push. Housing is extremely important. It's a national crisis, and we cannot underestimate how significant it is in terms of the impact on poverty, mental health, and all these issues. Therefore, I think we need to continue to invest heavily and put pressure on governments to treat it as a crisis. As a crisis, I think that governments all realize that the next elections will be over housing. This is an opportunity to put pressure on all governments to do something about housing, to provide allocation to housing, to treat it as a crisis the way we treated COVID, because it's extremely important, because without doing it and the impact of AI, the situation will get worse, not better. We need to push now. This is the time.
Thank you. Mary, advice, risks, opportunities for us as we think about assets like community space, land trusts, joint ventures with business. Any advice from you on the next 10 years and where United Way needs to lean in with our broad partnerships?
Well, you said earlier, Daniele, that, in the old days, and I agree with you, we can always learn from what we know and we learn the good and the bad, but you said community was at the table. In the old days, community was the table. So that's what I would say, is that the solutions, as much as I appreciate Benjamin raising the alarm and saying, look, all these forces are coming at us, yes, but all good solutions come locally. Everything has to be ground tested. That's why the United Way is so strong. You have members across a vast geography, and you have members across sectors. And one of the concerns I have about not just about COVID, but just Canadians in general, I don't want to be totally generalizing, but we tend to be a bit passive. We tend to wait. Oh, there's a housing crisis. Look, the government is coming to solve the housing crisis. Whenever I drive through East York and I see all those bungalows, workforce bungalows, do you know what I mean? They're in Etobicoke too. They're in your old neighborhood as well, Cheryl. And, they were self-built. John Van Nostrand always reminds us in the 40s that 60% of the housing that was being created in Toronto was self-built. Now, that's not possible now, but we can incubate really smart local solutions. And one of the concerns that I always have is that we tend to start to feel helpless. We think that, we've got to wait for some big grand solution, versus set the table yourselves. You, as the United Way and United Way agencies, are a great, important broker of interests and sectors, and you have a long, long history of doing this. So I would say, let's double down on that. Let's double down on the capacity you have to bring different sectors together. And let's double down on creating the enabling conditions. Who knows what the outcomes will be, but the enabling conditions for people to actually meet together and problem solve collectively. And that is dependent on space. So I think my encouragement would be to continue to work with the development community, work with all the different agencies that you're engaged with now, work with the public sector as it starts to dispose of their assets, to make the case to them, same with faith institutions, that those places have they've been tax-free for a reason, which means that you and I own them. They've had a tax benefit for 100 years. And so they have an obligation to continue to meet a community function. And so let's create the kinds of social infrastructure we need and inhabit those places and organize from there. So places, spaces, and doubling down on the local to make sure that we're actually leading from the ground. And then the other orders of government will start to, that's what you're doing in Scarborough. That's what and all the pilot work that Cheryl's doing. Governments learn, they don't lead. Sorry. Governments learn, they don't lead. So let's figure out what they need to learn, and then they will follow us.
Thank you, Mary. Cheryll, how do we do this, continue to do this with the DNA that is United Way, with community? Advice, ideas on how we, in a few seconds, keep community at the table. Better, to Mary's comment, make community the table.
Yeah, I think it's kind of been teased out so far in terms of you guys have been doing this work already. So continuing that work, continuing the learning journey. In terms of, you know, this idea around that, sorry, so in the human rights framing, right, there's 3 different levels of discrimination. There's direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, systemic discrimination. Systemic means that we can't even talk about the solutions that are or the issues that are at play. Indirect discrimination is where the solutions that we need to be investing into, nonprofit housing development, nonprofit ownership of land, or government ownership of land, right, non-market, is harder to do, right? So how do we make it easier to do that? We need to be putting in place incentives to support that type of developments, right? So when it comes to community groups being able to do that work, the United Way has been investing in the Infrastructure Institute, for example, helping them to train up their capacity to do social purpose real estate. And, you know, we're really pleased to be great partners with them. We often feed them recommendations of groups because we are working with groups on the ground to support this pipeline of development. And when you think about, you know, the supply in Canada, 3.5% of our affordable housing stock is non-market housing. So we are, according to Scotiabank, we're half of what our peers are. So OECD countries, on average, 7% of their housing supply is non-market housing. So the fact that we have 3.5%, well, if we can double that, at least we can be at our peer rate. But then what is the value of that? The fact that we have 3.5% of our housing as non-market housing, that means that we're able to have somewhat of a voice in terms of what is appropriate housing stock, right? So if we double that, then we'll have a stronger community of voices to then advocate to double it again, right? So that would be my advice. Keep doing what you're doing. I think we're really on the right path here, and I'm really excited to be part of this community.
Cheryll, Mary, Benjamin, thank you for what is really an opening hour dialogue that is poignant and perfectly setting the table for more big and small chats over the summer and fall with many of you, with new folks too, on what promises to be a most, dare I say, the most chaotic and accelerated, global and local, dense and intense decade in our GTA, calling us collectively to the wisdom of an Indigenous saying, quote, our impact rooted 7 generations hence, our sight set on the sunrise of the next decade, the woes and winds of our work, the wind on our back today and tomorrow, and a relentless refrain that increase for one can and must be increased for all. End of quote. end of United Way Greater Toronto 2024 68th annual meeting and the beginning of our work over the next decade, friends. Sing the song of increase. See you. Cheers.